If Christ is king, how should the Christian consider the kingdoms of this world? What does the Bible teach us about human authority and what it means to love our neighbors and our enemies? Before we render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, let's know what it means to render unto God what is God's. This is the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, the modern prophetic voice against war and empire.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Biblical Anarchy Podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Winograd. So for today's episode, I wanted to address a specific criticism that I've received, although it's not unique. It's just the latest in a certain type or pattern or form of an argument against biblical anarchy, against Christian libertarianism that I've come across a lot, that I feel like I've addressed before, but I feel the need to address it again. So I made a post on X, and this was about a week ago, and this was actually about, well, I was kind of connecting things. I was critiquing the state of Israel and the concept of Zionism, which I would construe as a sort of ethno-Jewish nationalism. And what I was doing was sort of making a point that people have inconsistencies in the way that they approach these topics. So to read my post, what I said was, and what I was quoting a post made by like Israel's Twitter account, so maybe more context here would be good. What they said was 10 million strong, resilient, unbreakable Israelis, 10 million Jews, Muslims, and Christians living side by side in the only Jewish democracy in the world, 10 million reasons to never give up. Here's the 2025. The key thing I was responding to here was and we hear this a lot when we're talking about foreign politics, international politics, American foreign policy, and a common defense of Israel is that, well, they're the only democracy in the Middle East. And then you'll also hear, and it's the only Jewish state in the world, and you will get accusations of anti-Semitism because it's like, well, why are you criticizing the only nation state that happens to be Jewish? And so my post was a response to that because I kind of find that a little bit wild of a way to approach that conversation. So I quote tweeted that and said, if it's okay to have a Jewish nation or democracy, why not a white nation or a Christian nation or any other ethnic or religious nation, or just swap out nation for democracy? You know, why don't we have white democracies? Why don't we have Christian democracies? Why don't we encourage I don't know of a black democracy in the world. Like, for every ethnic or religious category you could think of, you can go further, right? You could go intra-religious or intra-racial and ethnic, right? So like within white, because white's kind of just ambiguous, we get to Irish and things like that. Now, to some extent, these things do exist, right? You have Ireland, you have France, you have Scotland, which is part of England. So actually they don't have their own nation. I think what I'm doing here is demonstrating this gets very muddy. And you could do it for some religious categories too, like, you know, where's our Catholic nation? Where's our Reformed Baptist nation, right? So this gets very silly to be like, well, we have, you know, this is the only Jewish democracy. It's like, well, is that sort of the basis we should be approaching the global order? What is normative in terms of political structures? It's like, well, this is identity politics, right? Like, for as much as the right often portrays itself or themselves as being against identity politics, my point was that, well, it seems like you're okay with identity politics, just only with one or two select groups. And it's funny because a lot of the people on the right will call out Christian nationalism, which, to be fair, I also criticize Christian nationalism. But when they call out Christian nationalism, they're not critiquing it from a place of sound biblical theology or libertarian first principles of consistent opposition to identity politics. They simply reject Christian nationalism for its rejection of their identity politics and the proposal of a counter identity politics. And that's not something that I feel like I can get behind or champion, and rather it seems like something I need to criticize while simultaneously criticizing Christian nationalism, insofar as it's not kind of one thing, even though it's a bunch of different things. So that there is, even of itself, could be a whole podcast episode. It sets the stage for what I'm going to talk about here, because it's all connected. But someone, and I'm not going to name them, although it's public, so I could name them, but their name is Cody. I'm not going to give them their handle on X. You could certainly go look for it, just like you could go look for it now. So I'm not really doxing anyone. He said, well, a Christian nation would be great. And my response was, depends how you define that, right? Because I've always said, listen, if insofar as Christian nationalism is a sort of Mott and Bailey, right? I mean, the Mott is easily defensible. Like, I just want to live in a nation where the people are Christian. Like, that would be preferable to living in a nation where the people are not Christian. Like, if I had a choice between living in a country that was entirely secular and I represented like a small 1 to 5% minority of Christians, that would not be, at least to my preferences, right? That might be something God might call me to do, might call the church to do, has called the church to do at certain points in history, or even today. But in terms of my preferences, yeah, I'd love to live in a nation that was predominantly filled with Christians. I'd prefer it to be actual Christians, not just nominal Christians, but hey, I'd even probably prefer to live in a society where nominal Christianity or cultural Christianity was the norm. That's why I said it depends how you define it. Like, sure, yeah, if you I didn't really know what he was getting at. Was like, do you mean the Mott of the Christian nationalism argument, or are you talking about the Bailey? Like, oh, and what we mean by that is actually not just living in a nation that's Christian, but blasphemy laws, Sabbath laws, enforcing Christianity in the civil sphere, or a merger of church and state. There's a lot of different variants of Christian nationalism, but all of them involve a distortion of what governance is. All of them involve a distortion of the gospel. All of them involve a distortion of what Christian political action is supposed to be, which I sort of got into in my last episode where I was critiquing Redeemed Zoomer, which, by the way, you should go check out that video if you haven't already. And also, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. Or for you audio listeners, just a reminder to please subscribe, as well as leave a 5-star review to help this podcast grow. We appreciate that. Also, go to libertarianchristians.com/donate or biblicalanarchypodcast.com if you want to make a donation to help support the show, help support what we're doing here at LCI, as well as if you sign up for $10 or more a month, you have the ability to become an LCI insider, which comes with all sorts of perks. And it's a really good year to be an insider. We got a lot of really exciting things coming down the pipeline. So get first in line to receive all that. All right. So his response then was, I considered myself a Christian anarchist. I was a Ron Paul, Dave Smith guy, until I watched your debate with Andrew Wilson. Anarchism seems to lead to degeneracy. Dave recognized this when Thong Man, which I'll give you context for that in a minute, tried to debate him on open borders. Degeneracy cannot be tolerated. So, give me a sec here to drink something. Let me give you a little bit of context here, just because I'm sure those of you who don't know are just confused. Dave Smith, who I've had on the show before, comedian, podcaster, very popular libertarian. Dave, when he was at the Libertarian National Convention, had told a story on his show, maybe several shows, about how there was this person that's in the Libertarian Party who, I forget his actual name. I think he goes by a moniker of Star Child, and he dresses provocatively, including just walking around in, at least on the bottom half, in a thong. I don't think I've ever met him, but I've heard of him. I think I've seen him sometimes covered in different videos, people covering the Libertarian Party. And Dave was kind of making a point that, like, yeah, I guess we're both libertarians, but it's kind of hard for me to want to associate with the Libertarian Party sometimes when they have these kind of people who seem to use liberty as a license to be as degenerate as possible, which is not the style of libertarianism that Dave represents, nor would it be the one I represent either. And in the anecdote, Dave talks about that guy was trying to debate Dave on his position on open borders because Dave does not think that open borders is the right position. And I've talked about that in previous shows as well. I don't want to get into that can of worms. But the broader point about degeneracy and that anarchism, or you could just maybe swap that out, liberty leads to degeneracy. So let's break that down a little bit. Yes, but compared to what is my basic response? We live in a fallen world. We have the consequences of the fall, the consequences of sin, the consequences of man's sinful nature. And what the gospel tells us is that we are enslaved to our sin until we are born again in Christ, and we are given that heart of flesh instead of the heart of stone that we have before we are born again. And we are able to love God and have the law of God written on our hearts. Up until that point, we are only able to do good in a limited sense. And it is true that leaving people to their own devices will lead many to embrace their sin. And even with God acting as an agent in the world that seeks to restrain human sin to keep us from being as sinful as we possibly could, it doesn't mean that God's efforts are aimed at keeping people from not sinning at all, obviously. And so there will be a lot of sin and degeneracy, and all sorts of bad things will happen. However, compared to what? And I would say compared to what we have on available in terms of world history, and compared to what we have available to study in terms of biblical history, we start to see that this criticism actually is not very strong. And so my response here was the state leads to degeneracy more than anarchism does. That is the lesson of history and the Old Testament as well. Israel had issues, for example, during the time of judges. Bringing kings into the question, however, only worsened those issues. Now, I don't want to talk too much about the era of judges right now. I'm actually going to be talking about that in a little bit more expanded format in next week's episode, or the next episode. I forget if there's a 1 or 2 week gap between this episode and next episode. But the next episode will feature a more expanded version of the analysis or argument from looking at Israel during the book of Judges and Israel after they instituted the monarchy. But one important lesson here is certainly that the problem of people falling into idolatry, the problem of people and leaders giving into sexual immorality, these sorts of things existed on both sides of that dividing line. And it seems to me that even throughout history, we see that at best, what the state does with such laws is push such behavior into perhaps the black market or like the non-public spaces of society. So, sometimes people talk about Christian nationalism in terms of there's this expression like, the streets are clean, right? And yeah, again, like and I'm not even saying that that's not automatic, because I mean, there's plenty of examples of our government not allowing the streets to be clean, both literally and metaphorically. And sometimes even your best efforts to pass laws to limit certain behaviors in the public square, so to speak, on streets and parks and etc., fails, right? Because if the people hit a certain point of sinfulness and degeneracy, the law becomes unenforceable, right? And there's an important lesson here, which is that politics is downstream of culture, although it can go both ways, right? Politics can affect culture, but it's not a 1-to-1 ratio in terms of that impact, right? And I would even say it's easier in fact, when we're talking about the state impacting culture, it's easier for the state to promote degeneracy than it is for the state to promote virtue. And I would argue that's for a few reasons. One such reason comes, this isn't my analysis so much as one I'm borrowing from Hans Hermann Hoppe, who you can read about this in Getting Libertarianism Right, as well as Democracy, the God That Failed, that the state is ultimately a agent or entity of high time preference, meaning that it is based on a placing high value on immediate outcomes, on immediate gratification, so to speak, right? And not as much consideration towards long-term consequences, long-term investments, long-term gratification. Time preference as a concept is usually used economically, but Hoppe sort of augments it here in his writings, and I agree with this approach, to talk not just about economic calculations like having a lower high time preference when it comes to investments, but in terms of just everything in life, which I think that's very Misesian, right? If you understand, so Hoppe is an extension of Rothbard and Mises, which is the Austrian school of economics, which is based on the idea of human action. And so in some sense, everything we do falls in the realms of sort of economic calculations and considerations, falls under the realm of politics even. You can extend that further. And so yes, I agree with that. That is one important critique to consider here, which is that the state is ultimately an entity of high time preference. The state's not very concerned with long-term considerations, this is especially the case in democracy. You still have these problems in monarchies, but monarchies have different problems, but the time preference problem is perhaps not as exaggerated in monarchies as it is with democracy. Again, disclaimer, I'm not promoting monarchy, and neither was Hoppe. People misunderstand Hoppe when he makes that comparison. But because of things like public choice theory, where people are, they're more like, well, this isn't mine. These resources aren't mine. I'm just like, I'm have like temporary power and custody or like stewardship over these things, and I'm going to just exploit them to the best of my ability for my political agendas, for my short-term gains, and I'm not going to be in power in 8 years or 20 years. I'm not going to feel the consequences of these things. So, or they at least think they won't, and so they only act in their immediate self-interest. And I would say on a even more sort of like zoomed out sort of meta level here, that the state's only, the state isn't incentivized to effectively deal with degenerate behavior, when allowing the degenerate behavior allows them to continue pursuing their own interests, right? And their own power, their own hegemony. And this is not even just an observation that I think Hoppe expresses it in a unique way, but there's often this, and I'd have to do some research, might be worth doing an episode on. I don't know where the expression comes from, but there's a common expression in libertarian anarchist circles about the bread and the circuses, which is that like people are easy to, like, it's easy to get people to sort of be ignorant of the degree of their own oppression and subjugation or serfdom by the state and ruling elites if they are distracted by the bread and the circuses, right? And this isn't to say that all entertainment is bad, but there is a point where we can be easily sort of, and you can see the state encouraging, this is why I think the state spends money on giant football stadiums, and as much as I love football, right? And the state is incentivized to promote a culture that keeps the people distracted by pleasure and distracted by self-gratification, distracted by, I'd say even like, being dependent on certain drugs for physical and mental health issues, and that might be better cured or addressed without such interventions. There's a lot here. I don't have time to get into it all, but the point is that if people are distracted by the bread and the circuses, so to speak, they're not going to notice their oppression as much. You're going to be able to get away with a lot more oppression than if they weren't so distracted. So for all those reasons, on libertarian grounds, it's easy to say, and I think come to the conclusion that the state promotes and leads to degeneracy much more than liberty does. Because on the flip side, free markets are based on voluntary action. They're based more on lower time preferences. And there's at least degeneracy by default is generally not productive. And so without like sort of state subsidization or like state subsidies or state sort of sanctioned propaganda to promote and uphold a sort of culture of degeneracy, free markets would tend towards people that's not going to benefit them in the long run, and so they're at least going to have some sort of natural consequences that limit the extent to which they're degenerate, right? I mean, just like this is a bit of a reductio, but like if you have a welfare state, so to speak, right, and let's say everyone below a certain income is sort of subsidized like $10,000, you would see probably an increase in people drinking, going to bars, partying, like spending their money on certain degenerate things if they're being subsidized. I can't even speak today. I'm recording this early in the morning. Yeah, but if that behavior is being encouraged or incentivized, you're going to get more of it, right? So that's the basic argument there. And then I would end on this. Beyond just the libertarian considerations here, we have Christian considerations. And if we see that the state is actually not justified by Christian principles, but the state is inherently sinful, right, and based on sin, based on theft, based on the initiation of coercion, right, and if it's fundamentally at root a sinful institution and perhaps a degenerate institution, then why would we think that we can overcome evil with evil, right? I would say that using the state to limit degeneracy is actually one very obvious example of not listening to Romans 12, where it says that we do not overcome evil with evil, but rather overcome evil with good. And so what do we do then? Well, it's sort of a false question. Like, what do we do to limit sin? That's not our jobs, primarily, at least not as a direct consequence, because it's not the government's job to stop me from sinning. It's the Holy Spirit's. And that's not a quote from me. It's a quote from my good friend John Thomas, who actually a libertarian Christian who ran for Senate here in PA, who I've interviewed on the show. I'll link to that in the show notes. But it's a great quote, and I stole it from him, taxed it from him. And it's so true. Government is there to uphold rights, to enforce property, to deal with the administration of civil justice. It is not there, except very limitedly in the Mosaic Covenant, which we'll talk about this more next week. It's going to be a lot of the stuff is setting up for what I'm going to talk about next week. But just to put it, like the Mosaic Covenant was a temporarily instituted theocracy, which we do not live under. And by the way, even then it didn't work, right? People still sinned and fell into idolatry and did all sorts of degeneracy. And the civil aspects of it weren't very effective at stopping that. So rather what we see is that, under normative operations of what the Bible teaches, the role of civil government is in the pursuit of civil justice, and it's God's, the one in control of limiting sin. And then insofar as we have a perhaps role in trying to push back against sin in our society, our role is to simply speak what is true, to speak what the gospel says, and God will limit sin to the level he wants to limit it to. And beyond that, the only other the means we have of effectively limiting sin isn't through coercion, which then people will just find more creative ways to sin or to just hide their sin from the public square insofar as that, is enforceable. But again, it's only enforceable up to a certain point. And the more we focus on that, the more we have the opportunity cost of what is actually supposed to be the goal here, which is the Great Commission, which is the preaching of the gospel to bring the good news of salvation and freedom from sin to the world. And when people are actually set free and given a heart of flesh, they are then free to pursue God and to sin less than they could otherwise, and to do more good than they could otherwise. And when the church focuses more on what we hate and what we oppose, rather than, listen, good news does sort of imply bad news, right? But if we just focus on the bad news and forget that we have good news, then we are missing the actual call of the church. And so this isn't just a problem in terms of like my libertarian or anarchist considerations in not wanting a state. This is very consequential to what do we do as Christians? Because if Christian nationalism means we got to stop degeneracy, listen, we should be very bold in calling out what is sinful, but we should understand that the state is not a solution to that. And insofar as we find ourselves tempted by that, well, Jesus was tempted with power too. But I think Jesus knew, just like we knew that, and just like he had demonstrated, like throughout the entire Old Covenant, coercion and the sword will not save man from his sin. Only Christ can do that. That's what I'll end on. Next week's episode is going to get into some of these themes a little bit more in detail. We're going to be doing a biblical anarchy episode 1, but remastered. What is biblical anarchy? So if you guys want to go listen to that again, you can, or you can listen to next week's episode, which is going to be sort of an expanded, remastered, updated version of that original episode to sort of like restake the claim and just remind all of ourselves what this podcast is about and what we're aiming to do moving forward. So thank you guys for being here. Look forward to talking to you next time. Live at peace, live for Christ. Take care.
The Biblical Anarchy Podcast is a part of the Christians for Liberty Network, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. If you love this podcast, it helps us reach more with a message of freedom when you rate and review us on your favorite podcast apps and share with others. If you want to support the production of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, please consider donating to the Libertarian Christian Institute at biblicalanarchypodcast.com, where you can also sign up to receive special announcements and resources related to biblical anarchy. Thanks for tuning in.